Today I've referred the Premier Jacinta Allen to the Victorian Ombudsman. Just 2 months ago, the Victorian Ombudsman delivered a scathing report into politicisation of the public service. And just 2 months later, we learn of an appointment of Jerome Weinmar to a very senior role within the Department of Premier and Cabinet, carrying a salary of $500,000 with no proper merit selection process in place for a project that deals with one of the highest priority areas for the Victorian people, housing. The conduct I've referred to the Victorian Ombudsman is the very conduct the Ombudsman criticised in her report 2 months ago. If Jacinta Allen, as Premier, is going to thumb her nose at the Ombudsman, what message does that send for everybody else in the Victorian government? That it's okay to politicise the public service, that it's okay not to take your responsibilities seriously? The reason I'm referring this to the Ombudsman is Jacinta Allen, of all people, the Premier of the state, must show that she takes the Ombudsman's findings seriously. But there's a second reason I'm referring this to the Ombudsman. Housing is a critical priority for the Victorian people. More and more people are coming to this state. More and more people are desperate to find a home to live in, a house they can buy, even a unit they can rent. And if we don't have somebody who's in charge of that program who can actually deliver that extra housing stock that our state desperately needs, what hope is there for our state and the young Victorians in particular who are desperate to buy their own home? That's why I've referred this to the Ombudsman today. It's too serious an issue, not only because of the politicisation of the public service this perpetuates, but because we're not getting the best people for the right jobs. What happened to a state which used to have the very best public service, where we had sound and rigorous processes of appointment, where we had the best people in the country worked in the Victorian public sector? I'm not sure we can say that today because of this politicisation. That's why I've referred this to the Ombudsman today. Take some questions.
Is this a good use of the Ombudsman's time and taxpayer money?
Housing is a critical issue. We need to make sure we have the best people in place for these jobs. To appoint Mr Weinmar, and I've got nothing against Mr Weinmar, but frankly, you can't make these appointments without checking to see who's available and who might be the best person for the job. That's the first thing. The second thing is we had an Ombudsman report just 2 months ago warning against this type of appointment, the politicisation of these types of very senior appointments. Ultimately, the government chooses who it thinks is the best person for the job, but by all means, have a proper interview process so you can select the best person.
The Ombudsman stopped short of calling this behaviour politicisation, so what's the utility in investigating a single incident like this?
This is a very senior appointment of somebody who oversaw the Commonwealth Games and before that hotel quarantine. I think Victorians would agree with me that if this person is the best person for this job, when you haven't even conducted interviews with other candidates, when it carries a salary of $500,000, I think Victorians everywhere would be wondering, why is the government proceeding in this way and not checking to see who the best person is? We've got to clean up processes in the Victorian government. We've had a string now of IBAC and Ombudsman's reports into misconduct or poor procedures and standards in the Victorian government. And I think Victorians are saying enough is enough. And they want to see things turned around, and certainly from opposition and as the alternative Premier, I'm keen to put pressure now on the government to lift its game to get better standards in the public sector.
Are you hoping that there'll be a public inquiry by the Ombudsman with something reported back about this appointment?
I certainly would welcome and hope for some kind of public inquiry by the Ombudsman. Obviously, it's a matter for the Ombudsman to proceed in the best way possible. But ultimately, we've got to put a stop to this rampant politicisation in the public service. We all know what's going on. Remember, the Ombudsman said in her report that many people were too scared to come forward. And so we don't know the full truth about the extent of politicisation in the public service. So this is a really important investigation, and we think it's necessary if we're to fix the problem. If we're not to fix the problem, then Jacinta Allen would prefer, I'm sure, to see nothing done.
Is it politicisation when, as the Premier says, it was the Liberal Party who brought Jerome Weinmar over in the first place?
There's no suggestion that when Mr Weinmar was first employed by the Victorian Public Service that there was anything untoward in the process. What matters now, 10 years later, is why he's getting this Deputy Secretary role in the Premier's own department. after overseeing the Commonwealth Games debacle along with Jacinta Allen, and after overseeing hotel quarantine in such a prominent way. This is about the Premier's decision to make sure her mate got a job. And that's just not the way the Victorian Public Service should operate.
Still the Commonwealth Games inquiry, they're obviously down in Geelong today, and they've heard from people in the business sector that the state government hasn't really made any real moves around housing at all, hasn't set anything up. It's been 6 months since the Commonwealth Games was cancelled. Is that surprising?
We said at the time of the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games that the whole thing was a con. And what we're hearing now in evidence before the Commonwealth Games inquiry today is that that con is continuing. The Premier spoke in the days following the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games, one of the most humiliating things Victoria's had to experience in recent times, that this housing legacy would be a masterpiece of government policy. Well, it's anything but that. It's just proving to be a con. And what makes it all worse is one of her associates in Mr Weimar is now being given a job of overseeing housing and the implementation of the housing strategy, which we argue, for the same reasons, is just a con. It doesn't have any proper plan around it, and it certainly doesn't have any funding around it.
We also heard from the City of Greater Geelong that they never wanted that pool at Armstrong Creek, that it would cannibalise surrounding pools, that the community didn't need it, and that it would cost them $5 million a year to run. Should they just stop and save the money now?
Well, obviously, we shouldn't have any waste occurring. You'd have to look at where projects are at. But what it demonstrates is that it was a top-down approach and it was a political strategy rather than a genuine strategy to hold the Commonwealth Games. How can you ask local communities that are already struggling, their local councils have balance sheets that are really under pressure, and under Daniel Andrews and then under Jacinta Allen, they were asked to deliver local infrastructure projects that they couldn't afford themselves and didn't even want. And now the person in charge of that's been appointed to a senior role in DPC. It's not fair on those local communities to have been put under that pressure and then told now they've got to deal their own way out of the mess that Jacinta Allen and her government created.
Given what Geelong said about Armstrong Creek, that they've done their own research and that service isn't needed in that area, does the decision of the government to build a pool there anyway smell of pork barrel?
I think this is the problem. What was happening with the Commonwealth Games is that everything was centralised around the Premier and before her Daniel Andrews. It was a highly politicised process with no real planning or consultation with local communities. It was just a rort and a con to win the 2022 state election. And it's a sad legacy that will come out of this because local communities in regional Victoria feel gypped, they feel like they were betrayed, and they have every legitimate reason to feel that way. Thank you very much. We really need some aircon in this room.